Hello everyone, welcome to week 4. Alright, this is the last module, the first section, and this week we'll be focusing on terrorism and terrorist methods, patterns, and trends. Uh, this topic could probably be an entire course all into itself, but we're going to do our best that we can with it with this week. The chapter in the book this week is pretty short, so I supplemented it with several more readings, so be sure to read all the material for this week. Alright, so if you go and check out any of the publicly available terrorism databases, you can get a pretty good idea of the types of methods used to carry out terrorist attacks. And if you think about all the different definitions of terrorism we've talked about and the ones you've read so far in this class, you'll remember that just about all definitions of terrorism contain some reference to violence. So what you'll find is that there's a variety of violent methods that are used to commit terrorist acts or these terrorist events. So of all these methods and tactics that terrorists use, suicide bombing kind of presents special challenges to study and predict because obviously if you're a successful suicide bomber, those people aren't around anymore for people to interview them or to find out what motivated them or actually to talk to them. So because of this, researchers and law enforcement are forced to use and study unsuccessful bombers, the ones that don't blow themselves up, and then the writings and whatever successful bombers leave behind. So that's obviously a problem because not everybody leaves everything behind, right? Some of them do leave manifestos or notes and things like that, but some of them don't. So we may never know what really motivated some people to do it and other people to not. So another problem then is you have, and this is a problem with any type of terrorism research, is that you have small sample sizes, right? Terrorism is not a common event, right? Suicide bombings are not common events. They may seem like they are, seem like they're fairly common if you listen to the news or whatever, but they're really, they're not that common of events. So you end up with small sample sizes that you're having to look at. And when you have small sample sizes, if you had research methods, you'll remember that small sample sizes make it difficult to draw conclusions. Okay, it's difficult to say, if you have a sample size of 10, that applies to all. If you have 10 unsuccessful suicide bombers that you've interviewed, it's really hard to say that extrapolates out to encompass all suicide bombers, right? But obviously that does provide, some insight into them. It's just really hard to draw conclusions. So even though we're dealing with small sample sizes, researchers and law enforcement have been able to infer a few things about suicide bombing. And the first of that's a social process, and it is probably appropriate to use criminological theories for studying suicide bombing. One study found that suicide bombers commonly suffered some type of personal trauma or frustration. They commit bombings for ideological reasons because of social pressures. So then, because they have suffered some trauma or frustration, they seek out an organization that's similar ideologically to that of the bomber, and the organization and volunteering for a suicide bombing makes them feel significant, where otherwise in their regular life, maybe they feel insignificant. They feel like they're nothing. Okay, some kind of frustration related to that. And the organization provides the means and ends for everything that they're seeking. Okay. We also know religion plays a role in suicide bombing. However, it may not be as much as you think. We hear about suicide bombers related to radical Islamic terrorism, but only about 15% really of suicide bombings are religiously motivated. About 85% of them, according to a study in 2008, about 85% of them were done for secular organizations. So, like I said, even though we commonly associate suicide bombing with Islamic terrorism, and rightfully so. It is associated with that. Most suicide bombings are not done with religious motivations. So that about does it for stuff from the book. Be sure you read all of it. It's just a few pages. Then there's 2 readings at the end of the book, or end of the chapter. They both deal with suicide bombing, so be sure to read those 2. Now there's 4 more readings in the folder in Blackboard. One is more of a discussion of terrorist weapons, tactics, and targets. One deals with the evolution of suicide terrorism, and then the other 2 deal with religion and terrorism. So I'll talk about all of them, at least to some degree here. I'll begin with the first, which is the more general article by Lafree, Dugan, and Miller, entitled Terrorist Weapons, Targets, and Tactics. So this article starts with a description of the types of weapons used by terrorists. And if you look in the article, you'll see a pie chart, and there's a wide range of weapons that are used. But by far, the most common is explosives and firearms, which suggests and kind of means that terrorists most commonly use readily available weapons to carry out their attacks. If you put explosives and firearms together, that's about 88% of all terrorist attacks are committed with explosives or with firearms. So then they move on and they discuss how the 4 main types of weapons, explosives, firearms, incendiary devices, and melee, are distributed throughout certain regions of the world and then also over time. So all of these 4 main types of weapons were used across all 13 of the regions described in the Global Terrorism Database, which is where all the data for this article came from. And then also over time, explosives and firearms were consistently the most frequently used over time. So then they moved on to targets of terrorism. And they have a whole discussion there about how they coded things and how they distinguished what the targets of terrorism are. I don't have time to do all that in this video, so make sure that you read all that so you understand how they decided what the different targets meant. So what they found was that private citizens and property were the most commonly attacked target, followed by businesses, the government, the police, and military. So this also goes along with definition of terrorism, because terrorism is commonly associated with the attacking of innocent civilians. So private citizens and property were the most commonly attacked target. Overall, if you look, there were 20 actual categories of targets identified by the GTD, and then they had a kind of a catch-all at the end, and other, which was kind of a catch-all for everything that didn't really fit into a certain category, or maybe there wasn't enough information to really make a determination of what the target was. But you really had 20 different categories of targets. And so then they looked at them also across regions and over time, just like they did weapons. But unlike the use of weapons, the target type was much more region-specific. So look in the article and see how they were distributed, throughout the regions. The most common type of target also changed over time. All right, so unlike weapons where everything stayed pretty consistent, the type of target that was attacked varied from region to region and also varied over time. So then they moved on to terrorist tactics. The most common terrorist tactic was bombing/explosions, followed by armed assaults. All right, and that makes sense, right? From the beginning of the article, it said explosives and firearms were the most commonly used weapons. So the most common tactics then became bombings, explosions, and armed assaults. So if you put those 2 together, you end up with about 73% of all attacks. So then, again, across regions of the world, and the type of tactic used did vary across the regions of the world. And this makes sense. There's different groups, spread out across the world. Different groups use different tactics. So it did vary. But over time, it really didn't. Over time, the results remained fairly consistent, with the top 4 terrorist tactics being fairly the same. So there's a lot more information in that article. I just kind of did a real quick hitter on it, kind of the highlights. But be sure to read it. There's a lot of really good kind of background terrorism information in there. The next article is by Petizur and Martin, and it discussed the evolution of suicide attacks. I'm not going to spend a lot of time on this article, but Be sure to read it. The article essentially just discussed how our understanding of suicide terrorism has evolved over time, what the various challenges are, what they've been in the past, and what they continue to be to studying and understanding the phenomenon of suicide terrorism. So this article does a really good job of presenting the issues of suicide terrorism. It's easy to look at some news articles or something and say, oh, suicide terrorists are this, suicide terrorists are that, but it's much more complicated than that. And this article does a really good job of kind of outlining why is it complicated and what are the issues that researchers and law enforcement face when you're trying to draw conclusions about suicide terrorism. All right, so the last two articles this week are by Forrest, one by Forrest and one by Hoffman, and they both deal with religion and terrorism. So first I'll talk about Hoffman. Hoffman begins by discussing differences between religious and secular terrorists. Religious terrorists view violence as kind of a sacramental act or divine duty, and because of that, they don't seem to be restrained by the same kind of political, moral, or practical grounds as secular terrorists do. Secular terrorists oftentimes see violence as a problem. They feel like it could make people not support them. It could be problematic. Religious terrorists don't seem to feel that way at all. Religious terrorists also view violence as morally justified and necessary. So the religion then legitimizes the use of violence, which is different than secular terrorists. They also differ in what their core constituency is. Secular terrorists oftentimes attempt to appeal to those who they claim that they're defending or who they claim that they're speaking for, but religious terrorists don't really do that. Okay, their constituency is pretty much themselves and their religion. And this also seems to remove the restraints felt by secular terrorists. Okay, secular terrorists more often seek to make changes to a system. They don't seek to just destroy the system oftentimes. They seek to change the system to benefit a number of people who they say they're representing, right? The oppressed people. Religious terrorists generally only seeking changes for themselves and other members of their religion. So secular terrorists see violence more as a way to correct flaws in a system that is generally worth saving, where religious terrorists see themselves as they seek vast changes and want to install a new order. Right? They're not trying to save the order or modify the current order. They're trying to destroy the current order and replace it with something else. So Hoffman goes on in his article to discuss various religious terrorism factions and makes some interesting comparisons between some Islamic terrorism and some of the far-right religious terrorists. So that's really an interesting discussion in there. Be sure you go on and read the rest of that. Because it's really interesting how similar they are in some respects. And then the final article is by Forrest, and Forrest does a really good job of discussing individual terrorist groups, and he does a good job of a wide variety of them from around the world. So I'm not going to spend a whole lot of time on this because that article is essentially just this group talks about it, this group talks about it. So it's a great article to give you some background on the various types of religious groups around the world, where they're located, and what they're trying to do. So that pretty much wraps it up for this week. Obviously, I didn't have enough time to go into great detail about a lot of the readings. Honestly, each of those readings could probably be a separate 15 to 20 minute video, but that would have been too much for you guys and for me probably. So make sure you do read all the articles this week. The chapter in the book is really short, so please spend the time reading through the additional materials. Also, this is the last week of Section 1, so next week we'll be moving into Section 2. There's a discussion board due this week, and also on the calendar there's supposed to be a NIMS assignment due this week. I'm going to go ahead and cancel the NIMS assignments for this semester. with the government shutdown stuff, and then with another shutdown imminent. Websites aren't working properly. I can't find one of the trainings that I was going to have you do. So we're not going to have any NIMS assignments this semester, and I'll send out an email about that as well. So as always, I'll see you next week, and please let me know if you have any questions.